So our next speaker seems to be the author of many books. One of them, who was a very important book for myself, that I read about 10 years ago when I was a postdoc at the Imperial College in London. And it's a book that helped me get out of the reductionist, neurocentric framework that most neuroscience is embedded today. So Dr. Nicolas Langlitz is a medical doctor by training. He's an anthropologist and a historian of science and medicine who uses ethnographic fieldwork to think about through philosophical questions. He wrote 3 books: Chimpanzee Culture Wars, Rethinking Human Nature alongside Japanese, European, and American cultural primatologists; Neuropsychedelia, the revival of hallucinogen research since the decade of the brain; and these cite the psychoanalysis, Lacan, and the problem of, I can't read the German, sorry. He's professor of anthropology and director of the Psychedelic Humanities Lab at the New School for Social Research in New York. Welcome, Dr. Langlitz.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, for the kind introduction, and to the organizers for making this whole thing happen. So I had promised to give a talk about the situation Australia and Switzerland. Sorry, I have a hair in my mouth. But I realized that it was just too much to cram into 20 minutes. So I'll talk about medicalization more broadly and use the Swiss limited medical use program as a case in point. So the psychedelic renaissance. Sorry, how do I move this ahead? Oh, I have to scroll down. Okay. So the psychedelic renaissance appears to be based on medicalization as the royal road to bringing psychedelics into mainstream science and society. I think in the United States, the alternative to this would have been religion, and the Native American Church and UDV and Santo Daime have all been able to claim their First Amendment rights. But by and large, I think the approach to institutionalize psychedelics and what Timothy Leary had called dope churches has only had limited success. The sacralization of psychedelics did not generate this kind of widespread support underlying the psychedelic renaissance, but medicalization did at the end of the day. And I don't find that particularly surprising, because late modern societies value few things more than health. I got into this field in the mid-2000s during the preclinical phase of the psychedelic renaissance. And at that point, there was talk about therapeutic uses, but there were almost no clinical trials going on. The ways in which psychedelics were used then was to model psychosis, to study consciousness, to compare psychedelic states with other altered states, such as meditation, and simply to explore the neurobiology underlying psychedelic experiences. So medicalization, in the sense of developing psychedelics as medicines, was discussed, but it was not at all self-evident. And in fact, I did an interview back then with Franz Vollenweider, who ran one of the main neuroscience lab in Switzerland, in which he told me, I've always asked myself why there are so many people in the field of hallucinogen research who do funny things, such as taking drugs all the time and overrating these experiences, as if you just had to take these drugs and you got cured, and there would be peace in the world. We've already had that in 1968. If it would work, these goals would have been achieved long ago. Hallucinogens are no panacea, that's nonsense, and probably they're only for people who are more or less healthy. Interestingly, I recently found a related argument by Bernd Brabeck de Mori, who is an Austrian anthropologist who did fieldwork among the Shipibo, who argued that in the case of traditional ayahuasca shamanism, it's the healer who takes the substance, not the sick person, and the healing is attributed to the healer, not to the drug. And he argues that the attribution of the healing powers to Mother Aya basically already integrated the model of Western biomedicine into Amazonian neo-shamanism, where the idea is that, again, it's the compound that's doing the work. So looking at the psychedelic renaissance, Brabeck de Mori writes, in stark contrast to the indigenous concept, the drug is now ingested by the patients, that is, exclusively by people with diagnosed mental health conditions, even though a psychedelic experience may cause lasting mental health problems. Consequently, what's exceptional about the West, according to Brabeck de Mori, is that, quote, healthy individuals are not allowed to drink ayahuasca, while ill people may obtain a legal exception. So from this perspective, the medicalization of psychedelics does not amount to a resumption or appropriation of an ancient indigenous tradition, but it's a historical novelty and a cultural exception. So if you've spent too much time in the psychedelic bubble, then the medicalization and corporatization of psychedelics appeared to be a done deal until June 4th of this year, when this FDA public hearing happened that we've already discussed yesterday, which ultimately led to the rejection of market approval for MDMA-assisted therapy. There are still pending applications for psilocybin and LSD, but so far, the medicalization of psychedelics and entactogens has not succeeded. So here are two issues raised by the FDA's advisory committee that are directly related to the question of medicalization. First, the application was not for MDMA, but for MDMA-assisted therapy. And as we talked about, the FDA is not responsible for regulating psychotherapies. Eduardo Schenberg described psychedelic-assisted therapies as a paradigm shift in psychiatry, but this paradigm shift has not been followed by a paradigm shift in the corresponding regulatory systems. And the second issue is that critical psychedelic studies in the context of the FDA hearing presented medicalization as a Trojan horse and argued that the applicant was not really a pharmaceutical corporation, but a therapy cult that was out to spiritualize humanity. So here, medicalization is presented as a camouflage net for ulterior motives. Now, the question to me is, do the critiques of medicalization apply to psychedelic-assisted therapy? I mean, they obviously do not apply if medicalization or psychedelic-assisted therapy is really spiritualization in disguise, right? But even if we reject that interpretation and take the goal to be the development of a therapeutically effective medical practice, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy might represent a different kind of medicalization than, say, the treatment of depression with SSRIs. So this year's American attempt at medicalization failed, but Switzerland has allowed limited medical applications of psychedelics and entactogens since 2014. And I think a closer look at the Swiss situation provides a glimpse of what medicalization could look like. So the limited medical use program was instituted by the Swiss Federal Office of Public Health, which permits individual therapists to treat individual patients with LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA. In the past 10 years, more than 80 therapists got such permits to treat more than 1,000 patients. And what I find really interesting about this is that it provides a perspective on psychedelic-assisted therapy outside of a clinical trial context. And I think that is important because the clinical trial setting is a setting, right? And if you assume that the effects of psychedelics depend on set and setting, then you would assume that the RCT context produces one kind of effect, and in a different kind of context, for example, a real-world clinical trial setting, you might see a different kind of effect. I think one key problem of the trials is that in the trials, the therapy cannot be tailored to the needs of an individual patient. To generate comparable data, every subject should receive the same dosage of the same drug at the same intervals, and they should receive the same relatively short treatment over the course of a few weeks or months. This way, researchers can claim that the only difference between the experimental and the control group is that the former received the verum and the latter received the placebo. So that's very different from a psychotherapy situation, especially psycholytic therapy, which was the hallmark of the Swiss Association of Psycholytic Medicine, which had been promoting this policy change in Switzerland. Because in such a psychotherapeutic context, the drug is administered in response to the psychotherapeutic process, which can take much longer than a trial would. It ends when therapist and patient decide that the patient no longer needs the therapy. Drug sessions can be introduced after more than a year of regular psychotherapy. They can be spaced out if a patient needs more time to process an experience. They can administer small or large doses of the drug. They can switch between, say, MDMA and LSD as needed, even though they have to apply for a new permit for every switch. And the therapies are conducted in individual and in group settings. So if good psychotherapy was highly individualized, one would assume that there would be better treatment outcomes coming out of this limited medical use program than what we see in the randomized placebo-controlled trials. The problem is that we don't know whether that is the case. And the reason why we don't know is because the limited medical use program is no clinical trial, and it does not collect data on therapeutic efficacy or effectiveness systematically. What they are doing is they are submitting case reports to the authorities every year when they either have to declare the therapeutic use finished, or they apply for a continuation and a new permit. But this it seems that just on the basis of case reports that I've heard at conferences, psychedelic assisted therapy, even in this kind of context, still is a slow and arduous process which changes people's lives, but doesn't necessarily free them of all their symptoms. So, maybe Vollenweider is right, and psychedelics are no wonder drugs after all. So the authorities require these short reports from physicians once a year. But the focus there is on adverse events. It's not on therapeutic success. And this data is neither publicly available nor is it analyzed scientifically, which I think is a missed opportunity. Interestingly, the Swiss Association of Psycholytic Therapy seems to have made itself at home in this limited medical use program. So they started out as an organization that was comparable to MAPS, basically advocating for psychedelic therapies. But they have not spun off a for-profit company. They have no phase 3 studies going. They are not applying for they're not applying for market approval. Instead, they're currently urging the authorities to tighten regulatory oversight. So I don't know, maybe that's medicalization à la Suisse. Now, critical psychedelic studies have applied the critiques of medicalization to the psychedelic renaissance. We've already heard some of these points. Medicalization makes access contingent to having a medical diagnosis, as Christina pointed out yesterday. It's controlled by physicians. It does not enable recreational or spiritual drug use. It individualizes problems of living and neither addresses their social origins nor the need for human community and connection. It integrates psychedelic therapy in the profit-seeking pharmaceutical industrial complex, and paradoxically, medicalization simultaneously appropriates and delegitimates or delegitimizes indigenous knowledge. I think, the FDA decision shows that medicalization of psychedelics is still rather an aspiration than a reality. The psychedelic renaissance is less in cahoots with the powers that be than its critics had imagined. But Switzerland's medical use program does represent a step towards realizing medicalization. So, for example, it provides access which is no longer exclusively controlled and that is denied by law enforcement, but is a matter of negotiation between physicians, drug regulators, and patients. The focus is on the treatment of individual patients, yet their problems of living are addressed as interpersonal problems. Patients rework their social relations in the course of therapy. They decide to move in with a partner or seek divorce from a spouse. They forgive or break with an abusive father, or they change their job. The drug sessions often happen in group therapy settings, mostly because that's a way of getting for the therapist to get reimbursed by health insurances. But it's also valued for therapeutic purposes. So therapists argue that since this is kind of a more long-term therapy that often goes on for more than a year, people get to know each other in these groups, they form friendships, and thereby extend lessons that they learn during the drug sessions into their everyday life as they interact with other members of these groups. The drugs are free of patent protection and market exclusivity. The therapists believe that costs for the drugs are significantly lower than they would be if regulatory authorities granted market access. So it's about 300 Swiss francs for a psilocybin session. The overall costs of psychedelic-assisted therapy in Switzerland should be between 14 and 16,000 US dollars, but only 15 to 20% of this money is spent on the drugs. The rest covers the intensive psychotherapy, which costs 150 to 180 Swiss francs per hour per therapist. So 1 hour with 2 therapists is basically the cost of the drug. Market approval is expected to increase costs for the drugs, but also extend coverage by health insurances for the overall process, and that would reduce costs for patients. So even though Swiss labs also spin off startup companies, unlike in the US, there have been no fierce attacks on psychedelic capitalism in the Swiss discussions. And I think the reason for that is that Swiss citizens have access to healthcare and pay less and not more if medicalization succeeds on the regulatory level. So I think it's important to move beyond this sort of US centrism in the debate over the sort of medicalization in the context of psychedelic capitalism. To wrap up, I think it's unlikely that psychedelics will find an institutional home in late modern Western societies without medicalization. It's really an open question if they will find a home at all. I think it's perfectly conceivable that Vollenweider will prove to have been right and psychedelics turn out to be only for people who are more or less healthy. But if medicalization fails, I don't think psychedelics will simply disappear, because that's not what happened in the past either. I once interviewed Hamilton Morris, who said, well, even if music therapy turned out to be medically ineffective, we would still want to listen to music. Medicalization has proved an effective strategy because it mobilized enormous financial resources, but it shouldn't be the sole rationale. So then the question is, if medicalization fails, or if it succeeds but is found wanting, then how else will psychedelics be accepted into late modern societies? Thank you.